In the unforgiving desert of New Mexico, Prospector Jackson Reed's simple act of kindness towards a dying boy led him straight into a deadly trap. The Navajo warriors, led by the vengeful Taji, saw Jackson's mercy as a grave trespass, threatening him with certain death. But just when all hope seemed lost, Jackson's decision to negotiate for his life through diplomacy turned the tide. Listen closely to how one man's unexpected choice brought peace, defied the odds, and showed that even in the harshest lands, justice can prevail. The relentless sun hung high in the barren New Mexico desert, scorching the earth with a heat so fierce it seemed to melt the very air. Jackson Reed, a seasoned prospector, squinted through the haze, his heart heavy with frustration. For days, he'd combed the dry hills in search of silver, but all he'd found was dust and disappointment. His canteen, once full, was nearly empty, and his throat burned with thirst. The weight of failure settled on his shoulders like a heavy burden. His boots, cracked and worn, dragged through the sand, each step a reminder of how much further he had to go before finding even a semblance of hope. His mind wandered to the long journey ahead, to the desperation of returning empty-handed. But just as the thought crossed his mind, something caught his eye. A small figure moving slowly through the distance. At first, Jackson thought it was a mirage, another cruel illusion the desert so often conjured. But as he stepped closer, the shape took form. It was a boy, no older than 10 or 12, dressed in tattered clothing. His skin was darkened by the sun, his face pale from exhaustion. His eyes, though filled with a quiet resolve, betrayed a deeper, more desperate need. Jackson's steps quickened, his heart tightening with both confusion and concern. The boy was alone, staggering, with no signs of a tribe or any other people around him. His face was smeared with dirt, and his clothes were torn from days of travel in the harsh landscape. And worst of all, his eyes were sunken, his movements weak. "Hey there!" Jackson called out, his voice hoarse from the dry air. The boy didn't respond at first, but when he turned, Jackson saw the deep emptiness in his gaze. His heart clenched. "My name's Kenai," the boy spoke, his voice faint, barely above a whisper. "I'm lost. My tribe. I can't find them. I've been wandering for days." The boy's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Jackson's stomach twisted in sympathy. There was something about the boy, his quiet resilience, the silent plea in his eyes, that struck a chord deep within him. He understood that feeling. The endless search, the feeling of being utterly alone, chasing something that felt just out of reach. Kenai staggered forward, barely able to stand, and Jackson could see the dehydration taking its toll. His lips were cracked, his body frail. Jackson hesitated, looking down at his nearly empty canteen, but it wasn't a decision. He couldn't let the boy suffer. He unscrewed the lid and offered it to him. "Here," Jackson said, his voice softening as he handed over the water. "Take what you need." Kenai's hands shook as he took the canteen, his lips trembling with relief as he drank deeply. Jackson watched him, the boy's desperation mixing with a strange, silent gratitude. As Kenai drank, Jackson's own thirst seemed to fade into the background. It didn't matter. What mattered was the boy before him, a fragile life in the desert. Jackson couldn't stop himself from feeling a fleeting moment of compassion, something that had long been buried beneath his rough exterior, the years of hardship and the constant pursuit of silver. For a brief second, the desert seemed less hostile, less unforgiving. In this small act of kindness, the vast emptiness of the land didn't feel so suffocating. The boy looked up at him, eyes wide with silent thanks, but there was something more, something Jackson couldn't quite read. Perhaps it was the weight of the boy's circumstances, or maybe it was the simple fact that Jackson had given him something when there was little left for himself. Either way, Jackson felt the stirrings of a bond, one formed not of words, but of a shared fragile understanding. But as the last of the water was consumed and the desert heat settled back into its oppressive rhythm, Jackson had no way of knowing that this single, selfless act would soon set off a chain of events that would alter his life forever. The boy was not the only one wandering in this desolate place, and the desert's silence would soon be shattered. The air was still and suffocating as Jackson awoke. The faint light of dawn filtered through the sparse clouds, casting long shadows over the desert. For a moment he felt the comforting quiet of the morning, until he opened his eyes. The sight that greeted him sent a chill down his spine. The surrounding sand dunes were no longer empty. A sea of figures, dark and motionless, stood in a circle around him. The heat from the desert seemed to melt away as Jackson's heart pounded in his chest. They were silent. 250 Navajo warriors, each one holding their ground with a stillness that was more terrifying than any roar or shout. The desert had never felt colder. Jackson's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him like a blow. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just a group of travelers or traders passing through the wasteland. They were here for him. The boy, Kenai, was nowhere to be seen, but Jackson knew instantly that it was he who had led them here. The moment of compassion he'd shown, the simple act of offering water, had become his undoing. From somewhere in the crowd, Kenai's voice emerged, soft yet filled with a cold certainty. "You saved my life," the boy said, his tone strangely flat, as though the weight of his words had been rehearsed. "But now you must pay for your trespass." Jackson's pulse quickened, and his eyes darted around, searching for any sign of escape. But there was none. The warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces unreadable, their eyes hard with resolve. He was surrounded. He was trapped. His mind raced. The boy's words echoed in his ears. The boy who had once looked up at him in gratitude was now the very reason Jackson was facing certain death. But why? What had he done to deserve this? Had he trespassed on their land unknowingly? Had his simple kindness somehow provoked them? The warriors had been sent to capture or kill any white settlers, a harsh reality of the brutal conflict between the native tribes and the encroaching settlers. Jackson was a stranger in their land, a lone prospector who had crossed an invisible line, marked by his skin and his presence. And now, through no fault of his own, he stood before them as an enemy, a target. Jackson's hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his side, but his fingers were stiff with fear. He had no chance against so many. His heart hammered in his chest, the desert sun now feeling like a furnace, pressing down on him. Each warrior stood still, their weapons silent but threatening, their eyes locked on him. There would be no escape. His throat felt dry again, the weight of despair settling in. He could feel the heat rising within him, the searing sensation of injustice, of betrayal. The boy, the one he had tried to help, had led him to this moment. What had started as a simple act of mercy, a shared canteen in the face of the desert's cruelty, had now spiraled into something far more deadly. "You're not what I thought you were," Jackson murmured under his breath, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. He had trusted Kenai. He had believed in the boy's vulnerability. But now it seemed all of that had been a lie, a trap set in motion by forces far beyond his understanding. Kenai's figure appeared from the crowd, stepping into the circle of warriors, his face unreadable. He didn't seem like the boy who had been so thankful the day before. His eyes, once filled with the weight of a boy lost in the desert, now held something darker, something older. His gaze met Jackson's, and there was no sign of regret, no apology. Jackson felt the sting of betrayal, sharper than any blade. The boy he had helped, his only ally in this endless expanse of sand, had condemned him, leading the warriors to him without a shred of mercy. What had driven Kenai to this? Was it hatred for all white men? Or was there something else, something deeper at play? "Please," Jackson said, his voice hoarse with desperation, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "I'm just trying to survive, like you. I didn't mean to—" Kenai shook his head, a faint, unreadable expression on his face. "You are a trespasser," he said simply, as if those words were the only truth that mattered. "And now you must pay the price." The warriors closed in, their movements synchronized, a silent execution squad, Jackson's mind screamed at him for a way out, but there was no escape. His body felt heavy, as if the desert itself had risen to crush him. In that moment, Jackson Reed realized the harsh reality of the desert. It wasn't just a place of survival. It was a place where mercy was weakness, and where the price of kindness could be a death sentence. And as he stood alone, surrounded by the silence of the warriors, he understood. The desert was not just a land of thirst and sun. It was a land where betrayal and injustice could strike without warning. There would be no mercy here, only the unforgiving scorching heat of the desert sun. The air seemed to thicken around Jackson, each breath he took now a battle against the suffocating heat. Surrounded by 250 warriors, his fate hung by the thinnest of threads. His mind raced, heart pounding in his chest, but even as fear took root deep within him, another emotion began to stir. Anger. Anger at the unfairness of it all. Anger at being cast as an enemy when all he had ever wanted was to survive. Anger at the betrayal of Kenai, the boy whose life he had saved, who now stood as part of the force that might end his own. How could a single act of mercy lead to this? How could helping a child, a boy lost in the desert, result in a death sentence? But before Jackson could let that anger consume him, there was a shift in the air, a sudden movement from the warriors. The crowd parted, and from the depths of the circle, a figure emerged. The man who stepped forward was older than the rest, his face marked with the lines of wisdom and experience. His presence commanded immediate respect. This was the leader, Taji. Taji's eyes met Jackson's, his gaze calm and calculating. The warriors fell silent, their attention fixed on the two men. The heat of the desert seemed to pause, just for a moment, as if waiting for the exchange that was about to unfold. "You saved the boy," Taji said slowly, his voice measured but firm. There was no malice in his tone, only a quiet acknowledgement of Jackson's actions. "But your fate is not ours to decide. You must prove yourself." Jackson's pulse quickened. Was this the moment when his life would end? The choice between life and death had always been out of his hands, but now he had been given a sliver of control. It felt almost like a cruel joke. Was there truly any way he could prove himself worthy of mercy? Fear threatened to paralyze him, but the anger bubbling just beneath the surface was stronger. He clenched his fists at his sides, trying to steady his breath. There had to be a way to survive this. There had to be a way to turn this situation around. Jackson Reed had faced the harshest elements of the desert, but this was a trial of a different kind. "You have two choices," Taji continued, his voice cutting through Jackson's thoughts like a blade. "Fight for your life or negotiate peace." Jackson swallowed hard, the weight of the decision settling on him like the scorching desert sun. His mind screamed at him to take the fight, to stand his ground and face whatever came next, but his instincts told him otherwise. Fighting would only lead to bloodshed. He had already seen enough of that in the past. No, there was another way. He could try to reason with them. He could try to survive without more violence. With a steadying breath, Jackson straightened his back and spoke, his voice clearer than he had expected. "I don't want to fight," he said, his words carrying a weight that surprised even him. "But I can help you. I know the desert. I know how to find water, how to survive its wrath. You need my knowledge as much as I need my life. Let me help you, and I will prove I'm not your enemy." The words felt strange on his tongue, but as they left his mouth, something within Jackson clicked. This wasn't just about survival, it was about dignity, about finding a way out of this mess without losing his soul in the process. The warriors were quiet, their gazes unreadable. Jackson held his breath, waiting for a response that felt like it would never come. To his surprise, Taji did not immediately order his death. Instead, the elder took a long moment to consider Jackson's words. His eyes flickered with something Jackson couldn't quite place, a mixture of curiosity, perhaps respect, or maybe even the slightest hint of understanding. Whatever it was enough. Enough to grant Jackson another breath. Taji nodded, his expression unchanging. "You have courage, white man. We will let you live, for now. But know this, your fate is not sealed. You must prove yourself in time, or the desert will take you as it does all who do not belong." The tension in Jackson's chest didn't fully ease, but it was the first sliver of hope he had felt in what seemed like an eternity. He had bought himself time to figure out how to survive, how to earn their trust. The warriors, who had stood like statues just moments before, slowly began to move. There was no celebration, no relief. The silence remained, oppressive and heavy. But Jackson had earned a small victory. He wasn't dead yet, and in the face of the desert and the hostility of those who had once been his potential executioners, that was enough. For now. Months had passed since that fateful day when Jackson Reed stood on the edge of his life, surrounded by the watchful eyes of the Navajo warriors. The desert, once an unforgiving foe, had slowly become something else. A teacher, a constant reminder of his resilience. Jackson had not just survived, he had earned something far more precious: respect. Each day he had shared his knowledge with the warriors: how to read the land, how to find water when the earth felt as dry as bone, how to keep hope alive when the sun threatened to scorch it all away. His skills as a prospector, honed over years of searching for silver, became his greatest asset, and through them he bridged the divide between two worlds that had always been at odds. Jackson had been a stranger, a trespasser in their eyes when he had first arrived, but now he was something else, a reluctant ally. It wasn't just his knowledge that had earned him their trust. It was his unwavering will to help, even when it would have been easier to turn away. There had been no promises of rewards, no guarantees, but Jackson had given what he could, in the simplest form of survival, sharing what he knew to ensure others could survive too. By the time he was able to return to his camp, his body was weary, covered in the dust and sweat of endless days. Yet, despite the exhaustion that weighed on him, there was something else in his chest, something that hadn't been there before, a deep, almost indescribable sense of triumph. The Navajo had accepted him not because he had been the most skilled, nor the strongest, but because he had shown them something they rarely saw: mercy. Jackson had extended his hand when no one would have blamed him for letting go. He had fought not with fists or weapons, but with something far more powerful: his will to change the course of his fate. As he stood at the edge of his camp, the sun dipping low behind him, Jackson felt the weight of what he had accomplished. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was about forging a new path. The Navajo people had come to see him as more than just an outsider. He had become a symbol of possibility. In a land where peace had always seemed out of reach, Jackson Reed had shown them that it could exist, even in the harshest of circumstances. He had bridged the gap between two worlds, worlds that had once seemed doomed to clash forever. It had been a long and difficult journey, filled with trials that could have broken even the strongest of men. But Jackson had held on to the one thing that had carried him through the worst of it: hope. It was a quiet, unspoken triumph. No grand gestures, no celebrations, just the simple knowledge that his actions had made a difference. Jackson had walked into the desert with nothing but the will to survive, but he was walking back with something more valuable, something that could change the course of history. Jackson's legacy would not be one of violence or victory through force, but of inspiration. His story would echo far beyond the dry winds of the desert, carried by those who had witnessed what one man could do when he chose mercy over anger, diplomacy over force. It was a legacy of resilience, of understanding, of a man who had found a way to live with those who once saw him as an enemy. And though Jackson didn't know it yet, his name would be spoken for generations to come, not as the prospector who found silver, but as the man who found something far rarer, a way to unite what had once seemed impossible to unite. Through his actions, Jackson had proven that even in the face of overwhelming opposition, the smallest acts of kindness could reverberate through history. And it was that power, that simple, unassuming power, that would change everything. In a world where mercy often seemed like a lost cause, Jackson Reed had shown that sometimes it was the only way forward.